Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 231 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Aimee Bender. She's the author of the novels An Invisible Sign of My Own and The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake, as well as the short story collections The Girl in the Flammable Skirt and Willful Creatures. Her short fiction appears in Granta, GQ, Harper's, Tin House, McSweeney's, and The Paris Review, and she also teaches creative writing at the University of Southern California. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new short story collection, The Color Master. And now, here's our interview with Aimee Bender. All right, so we're here with Aimee Bender. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so I've heard you say that as a kid you were really into fantasy books. So tell us about that.
Yeah, I think those were by far my favorite books. So the whole gamut, all the Madeleine L'Engle books. She kind of has a split canon of half magical, sciencey, and half realistic. And I always vastly preferred the magical, sciencey ones. And C.S. Lewis and the Oz books I actually loved pretty deeply. I guess there's a wonderful book by Julie Andrews, famous singer Julie Andrews, called The Last of the Really Great Whangdoodles. That's a fantastic book. I love that book. I also liked, when I moved into kind of adolescence, I was interested in horror too, but more so that than science fiction at that stage. I think it wasn't an easy segue from the fantasy books as a kid into science fiction, interestingly.
So, how did you get into the fantasy books? Did you have parents or teachers or friends who were reading them as well, or?
Yeah, I have two older sisters, and I kind of just would poach whatever they were reading. So they read everything, and we were just a kind of reading family. So there was just tons of stuff lying around, and I think I can't remember specifically, but I just think we would go to the library and just get stacks of things. And that was always my leaning. I think there was something about the imaginative leap in those worlds that felt so exciting. And, just like the Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe feeling of that it's a wardrobe, something so based in a house, something so relatable that can be traveled through, the kind of precursor to Harry Potter mania,
Well, right. I heard you say, though, that at that time, I think most of the kids were reading like Judy Blume and stuff like that. It was a little bit more unusual to be reading fantasy. Yeah,
I guess that's true. If I think of my peers, everyone was reading Judy Blume, and it was all about Judy Blume. And I read those too, but it was pretty evident then, and I would say it's parallel now too, that I read it and I was interested in it, but it didn't grab me. It didn't feel like nourishment the way that the other books did. The fantasy books, they just tapped into something deeper and something sort of primal. And the other books felt like they addressed my daily life or concerns I might be having, but they didn't go to that deeper place. So, and I also think I was a slower bloomer than it just mentally in terms of adolescence and all of that. So those Judy Blume books were they were just like a little fast for me to even be thinking about that stuff. And I think a lot of my peers, were the opposite and were wanting to kind of rush ahead into puberty and all that. And there was something about the fantasy worlds that was comforting that way too, because it was addressing things in a totally different way. Like the Philip Pullman trilogy, His Dark Materials, there's so much going on about growing up in that, but it happens in this really metaphorical way. So then you can be processing things. That's how I think I like to think and teach fairy tales too. Like they are tools of learning, but you don't know what you're learning while you're learning it.
Well, right. The Philip Pullman books are sort of a response to the Narnia books. And there's this really interesting line in Narnia where one of the girls kind of grows up and discovers makeup and high heels, and then she can't go to Narnia anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there was a real fear of that. They talk about that in The Little Prince too, right? This idea of grown-ups not understanding. And there's kind of the rare grown-up that can understand the imaginative world of the kid. And Roald Dahl talks about that too. It's kind of all over the place in kid books. And it's a little terrifying because then you think, what am I going to turn into? I don't want to let go of this. And I think I felt in a way kind of commanded to let go of it. And it wasn't just the Judy Blume movement in that kind of elementary school time, but by high school, everything we read, or the majority of what we read was realism. And I didn't have any exposure to writing that wasn't realistic. And so I figured that it ended just like the High Heels, right? The Narnia was closed off, and it was closed off in literature too.
So, I mean, was that just sort of a presence, or were there any specific incidents where you were made to feel childish or something for reading fantasy?
Interesting question. I don't think I advertised it. Maybe that's the signal about it. I would reread those books so often. I read those Oz books 20 times each. I mean, I just knew them by heart. I read A Wrinkle in Time so many times. And I think I can't think of an incident in particular, but I think I did feel like there was something about them I felt like there was some sort of cultural acknowledgement that they were supposed to be put aside earlier. And so if I was reading them in junior high, or if I was looking at them in high school, then that would be kind of a source of shame if I had admitted it. And I loved The Wizard of Oz, the film. I loved that movie. And it too, like, it engages in fantasy in such an interesting way, and where it has this kind of realistic frame, but then the Oz part being literally in color. And so you feel so much, it's so much more beautiful than the rest of the movie, though. When this makes me feel really old, but when we would watch Wizard of Oz, it was on once a year, and we had a black and white TV until I was probably 12. So it was always like not that interesting when she would go to Oz. She'd open up the door of her little cabin, and then it would look still black and white. Like later when I saw it on a big screen in Technicolor, it was so different. I understood so much better why it was a shock to her standing there holding Toto. But I would dress up like Dorothy. I had a whole ritual that I think was loaded in so many ways, but I just revered the movie, and I revered that kind of move into fantasy and the wonderful sense of those characters. And so I would dress up like Dorothy. And there was a point where I felt like I really shouldn't be doing this anymore, but it would be on once a year, and I would I had like a nightgown that was gingham, and so I would enact this sort of movie worship.
Well, right. So you make it sound like you didn't quite fit in, and you were sort of keeping this secret from other people a little bit. Did you have a facade of normality, or could people kind of see through that?
Yeah, I would say facade feels too extreme to me, because I did have a pretty comfortable social life, and I didn't feel excluded, and I didn't feel I had friends, and I think I knew how to engage with people. It just felt like this part was maybe more private. So I think why facade doesn't quite feel right is I felt like I was engaging with the friends honestly, like it was really also me. It's just that this other part was kind of roiling around underneath. And that really is totally the source of where my writing comes from. So it's just, and people often, when they meet me at readings, will feel like a little surprised that I have a kind of normal manner, whatever that means, right? I mean, it means nothing. Like, I don't even know what I mean when I say it. But the normalcy that I project is not false. That's real too. It's just that it's in the writing that I can access the other stuff, and it was in the reading that I could access the other stuff, and I didn't know how to integrate that except through words and stories.
Right. So if you got to this point where you felt like you kind of had to put the fantasy type stuff away, how did you come then around to writing the sort of fiction that you do?
It took a while, because I really, I can probably track it to sort of junior high and high school and college, feeling it was also kind of Raymond Carver time, and there was such celebration of a kind of parboiled American realism and value of that. And I really love Raymond Carver, and I actually think upon looking at him through a different lens, I can see how odd his stories are, and how he kind of seeks out these strange moments. But so it took a long time, because I was just feeling like the way to be taken seriously as a writer and to be considered literary was to try to write something more realistic. So it took until I was in grad school, and I wrote short pieces that were shorter than the other people in workshop. And we said we had maybe like 30 pages as our limit. And so I would turn in two, and I would turn in one that was kind of my attempt to be more the realistic writer. And then I kind of had pages to fill. Like, let's say the realistic writer one was 12 pages that felt like I wasn't doing my job. So I would turn in a 6-page story that was like a person going through reverse evolution or something that ended up being more of what my writing feels like now. And I would say it was one of the shocks of like one of those, you can sort of track certain moments in your life where you realize things that are so obvious, but you didn't really know it. So that people were like, oh, this second story is much better. And I just didn't expect that at all. And it was so liberating to hear that. And I kind of ran with it after that.
So why do you think that was that people preferred? Is it just because you were being more true to yourself, or?
Oh, yeah, I think it was totally better. I mean, I think it was without question more interesting. The language was more vibrant. I felt more in it. It was more emotionally alive. It was just a better story.
Yeah. I mean, and your work, a lot of it has this very sort of fairy tale quality to it. Were you always, like, were you conscious of that? How did the fairy tale stuff come into it?
Yeah. And I mean, fairy tales I connect to fantasy. They're kind of all on a spectrum in my mind. And I also read fairy tales constantly and from different countries, and those were books that we did have kind of around my house. And I loved them. And I guess I would say that also when I went to grad school, there was an interim director named Judith Grossman, and she was there. She picked the class that I was in, and that was the only year that she picked the class because Thomas Keneally was leaving and Jeffrey Wolfe was coming in. So it was this kind of shift in lineage, and she was just there for that. She was director for that year. So she picked a very eclectic class, and she loved fairy tales. And so she put them on a reading list. Like, she sent a summer reading list, and I felt so inadequate in my gaps in terms of reading. And I was looking at all these books that I had to catch up on and feeling totally overwhelmed. And then in the middle, she had Andrew Lang's Lilac Fairy Book. And he used to compile these fairy tales from around the world and put them in fairy tale books titled by color, the Lilac Fairy Book, the Ochre Fairy Book, the Crimson Fairy Book. And those were one of those books that I would read religiously. And that was a really, it was such a validating moment to see that she considered that literature in the same way that she thought about Dostoevsky or Jane Austen or all these different writers that she had on the list. So I think that also felt kind of liberated at that grad school time, was the idea that fairy tales had value for adult readers and that could be used as a tool in storytelling, and that all of them.
Yeah, I mean, because to me, one of the distinctive characteristics of your writing is that very often the viewpoint characters don't have names.
Yeah.
Which I think of as being a sort of very fairy tale sort of thing. Is that where that came out of?
Yeah, exactly. And I remember really clearly, in just thinking of like all the workshops I've been in my life, there was a workshop I was in San Francisco at San Francisco State, and they let non-enrolled students for some reason go in the class, and it was taught by this wonderful writer, Jane Vandenberg. And it was like 30 people in the workshop. It was huge. And I turned in a story that had a kind of fairy tale tone, but I hadn't really absorbed that idea about names yet. So everyone had names, and all the stores had names. The bookstore wasn't a bookstore. It was, I think, a B. Dalton, which is also like, so it's like,
well, that's something it seems like something from a mythical past, no?
Exactly. Long enough time goes by, and even B. Dalton feels somehow enshrined with that glow. So this woman, Jillian, I totally remember her. I have no idea what her last name was, but she said, why don't the tone of your stories doesn't feel like these names fit. And why don't you just say bookstore, and why don't you just try boy and girl or man and woman or whatever? Like, I don't remember how much she spelled it out, but that was another kind of light bulb moment, because I didn't like how the names looked. Like, they feel kind of intrusive sometimes on the page to see a name with a capital letter when you're trying to make something in more of that fairy tale tone. And for me, it felt like I could get to something truer in the story if I did away with names in some of the stories.
Yeah. Well, and so this new book, The Color Master, there are 3 stories that deal very directly with fairy tales. There's the Color Master story itself, the Devourings, and the Red Ribbon.
Yeah.
Can you just talk a little bit about how fairy tales inform those stories?
Yeah, definitely. I would say this book is the first book where I've actually used, and you're right, all 3 of those. I don't even think of the Red Ribbon as in that packet, but it is that I was using existing tales and trying to do a retelling. That in my other books, it's always been a feeling of an influence of fairy tales, but not a direct nod. And the Red Ribbon, it's that kind of folklore tale of the woman with the red ribbon around her neck who's wears it, and then when her husband takes it off one day, her head falls off. It's kind of like a classic camp horror story. And I think I've always been enamored of that story, and it crept in. The other 2 were much more deliberate in terms of using the stories. That one crept in a much later draft of that story. The idea of what is that story about? Why is that story so horrific? What is going on there? And trying to unpack it. But the other 2 come from this fairy tale class that I teach, and I teach it almost once a year to freshmen and sophomores, and I have to reread the fairy tales for the class every time because, they just read them and it's fresh to them, so I have to refresh myself. So I've read Donkey Skin, the Perrault story about these 3 amazing dresses, the dress the color of the sun, and the dress the color of the moon, and dress the color of the sky. I've read it so many times. And there's this other one, kind of a Molly Whoopie story, which is about sort of like a Jack and the Beanstalk story about these kids coming and essentially playing a trick on a giant so that they escape. And the giant in those stories ends up killing his children. And in mine, he ate the children. Because it actually seemed, there's always the Jack and the Beanstalk concern of fee fi fo fum. I smell the blood of an Englishman. I'm going to eat Jack. And it seemed like if the ogre or the giant thought he was going to go into the room and eat, he was going to eat something. Like he wasn't just going to kill. Like I almost felt like the fairy tale had dodged that grotesquerie. So anyway, so I read those stories a lot, and I think I just felt so steeped in their images that I wanted to take them on. And for the Color Master, I wanted to think about what kind of tailors would make dresses the color of sky, moon, and sun. What is the color of the moon? What is the color of the sun? How do you make that in such a way as to change someone's life, as they do in the Perrault story, and as they did in mine too? And with the Devourings, how does a marriage survive if your husband eats your children? And to try to take that through the lens of realism, to take this absurdity, but to try to tell that story realistically. And I had so much fun writing both of those in particular.
I totally endorse that change of the ogre eating the children. I think that storytellers for centuries have been totally missing the boat on that, because that's obviously the way the story should go.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you see what little changes are in there. Like apparently, we read some Bruno Bettelheim in that class too, and he talks about psychoanalytic views of fairy tales. And there was one point where he talks about Red Riding Hood and sewing that the wolf is drowned because they didn't want to have it be that when they pull Red Riding Hood and the grandma out of the wolf, that then the wolf just dies, because that would too much resemble childbirth. And there were so many women centuries ago who would die in childbirth. So the story, I think, through the retellings probably flopped when the wolf bled to death on the floor. Probably the kids didn't like that. So the retelling that we get more commonly now is the huntsman or someone puts rocks in the wolf's stomach and sews him back up, and the wolf drowns. Or in some of them, the wolf just is banished, or the wolf slinks away, whatever. But I thought that was so interesting too, that what are the ways the stories evolve to address our anxiety. So maybe it was just too grotesque to have the ogre eat the kids. But I'm with you. He's got it. That's what he would do.
Well, and speaking of this donkey skin story, I have a friend in New York who is a folklore scholar, and one time she showed me this book she had where it was this compendium of these fairy tales, basically, and all the versions of Donkey Skin were all numbered. It was like 102B and all these things like that. There were hundreds of variations on this one story.
Wow. I would love to see that. And they were all stories, or were they paintings as well?
This was, from what I remember, it was sort of a synopsis, like a little, just a little description of how this version differed from all the other versions. And it was just page after page after page of that, just for Donkey Skin. I mean, there were so many variations.
Yeah. They have these amazing kind of documents. There's like Vladimir Prop, and there's the Arnott Thompson index. Do you know about this? Where they took all the fairy tales and they made kind of a mathematical breakdown. It's not quite mathematical, but it's like a breakdown of 1A, 1B, 1C, like giant or planting of beanstalk, and then the story goes sort of like a flow chart, like A. Yeah, and they just made it a kind of foundation of research to think how the stories diverged, which sounds a little bit like that folklorist's book. And it is amazing. And the stories, they show up in different countries in similar forms in places where there weren't obvious trade routes. So it's unclear if the story traveled or if the story just emerged similarly, if these stories kind of had to happen. And so every culture invented some version of it, or if the story traveled through the Silk Road or something and found its way from China to Mongolia to Russia, like who knows? But I think that's so interesting because they're entirely authorless.
Right, and it is sort of a weird evolutionary process, and like you say, you could have these convergent evolution things going on where just whatever people liked telling were the ones that survived and had children, had offspring that could then be selected from, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Right, the story offspring. I think that's right. And now Disney's this huge contributor, and how will Disney's so dominant, but Disney's still just another voice along the pathway of it. When I teach, a lot of the students have only seen Disney. They sign up for the class because they think we're going to watch a lot of Disney, but they willingly go along with some Angela Carter and stuff.
Talk a little bit more about that class. What would you say, what sort of relationship do you think the students today have with these old fairy tales? Like, what role do they play in their lives, or how do they feel about them? Or?
They're kind of amazing students because most of them are not familiar with them. I'd say there's usually one or two who read fairy tales as a kid, and most of them grew up on Disney. And in fact, now they're like right around where the Little Mermaid kind of hit them at birth or something. I forget exactly, like they were just like raised in Ariel or whatever. So, but they're really thoughtful about reading them. They like them and they respond to the swiftness of them. And we read, Calvino has this great essay about economy of language, and we talk about how fast the stories move. And then they really like all the retellings, and there's so many weird retellings. So, I think they're surprisingly open. And this class is not English majors. So it's like business and comm and science and pre-med and, some arts kids, but not majority. And so that's also kind of interesting.
Right. Now, it seems to me that the pre-Disney fairy tales are mean-spirited in a way that is sort of almost unimaginable for people today. I don't know if you agree with that.
I half agree with it. I don't know if I'd say mean-spirited. I would maybe say dark and violent. But sometimes it comes from mean-spiritedness, and sometimes it's like just these weird actions happen and the motivations are not totally clear. But yeah, Disney wouldn't be up for that. And sometimes the story loses some bite. Bettelheim says the story has to have the happy ending in order to work on a child. Like you have to emerge from the woods, but you have to go into the woods. That's where Into the Woods comes from, the musical and the movie and all that you have to go into the darkness to get out of the darkness. And that for a child and for adults too, that to have a safety rail as you go somewhere frightening, the safety rail being the happy ending, means you'll go there because you'll know you'll be out of there.
But it depends on your point of view too, because most of them don't have happy endings if you're the witch or the giant or whatever.
Totally. Totally. And I think for whatever reason, we're in a cultural time where like the former villain is now sympathetic, like Wicked, and I haven't seen Maleficent, but I've heard that's obviously the thrust of that. And so so I think there is more interest in kind of maybe that is a hopeful way in this kind of scary era we're in, but maybe there's something hopeful about the fact that people are interested in the full story, at least in these narratives.
No, I think so. Yeah, to just not accept the idea, to just not accept at face value that so and so is the monster, but to always be thinking, sympathetically about every character in the story.
Yeah, it's kind of a big deal.
Okay, so I want to ask you too about some of these other stories. So, Tiger Mending, you say was inspired by this painting. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so there's an artist named Aimee Cutler, and she's a painter, and she does a lot on gouache. I think that's how you say it, gouache. And there was this pairing, Black Book, the magazine did a pairing of writers and artists, and I think they gave me 3 people to pick from, and I picked Aimee, and I think a few years even before that, she and I had been in touch because she's also kind of a lover of fairy tales, and her work is so interesting, and it's a lot about women in industry, where she has women doing these odd jobs, like they'll have chairs on their heads and they're sort of bucking like antlers, or they're sewing something, not just tigers, lots of things, or they're flying kites with, I think, keys on them. They're really compelling images and easily findable online. But I totally wanted to work with her, and they said, okay, I had to pick a painting of hers and write a story off it. And so then the next thing was picking, because these are so many images. There's pigs under the bed of women. I think it's almost entirely women in her pictures, which is really interesting, but they also look kind of women of 150 years ago, and they have this sort of strange modesty to them. They're fascinating. And so Tiger Mending was the one I picked, and then the picture is an image of 3, I believe it's 3 women, and they have tigers in their laps, and they're sewing on the stripes. And it's just beautiful. And apparently several people have gotten it as a tattoo, which I think is a really neat tattoo. And I think for me, so much of the work was in that image that she had done. And then it was trying to wrap a story around it and think how did this moment happen, and what might it mean?
And I'm sorry, who gave you this assignment?
This magazine called Black Book. I think it's still around. It's like a glossy magazine. There's another thing now called 7x7, which is pairing writers and artists. And that one is more collaborative. I just did that, which was really fun, where the guy Lawrence Lee sent me a drawing, and I wrote a page, and then he did a drawing based on my writing, and we did it 7 times each. And so this one, the Black Book one, was kind of like that, but it was just the one painting.
That's interesting. So have you gotten feedback from Aimee Cutler at all on your story?
Yes. No, we had a great conversation about it. And so she had her work collected in a hardback book for a German publisher, an art publisher. And they asked me to write the introduction or a forward commentary. And I think they wanted to use the story. So the story's in there, and then maybe there's a little commentary from me as well, but mostly it's the story that is my commentary. And so there's been a nice back and forth several ways, and these tattoos and people who know her work or who know this, my work, and kind of finding this convergent space. It's pretty cool.
Is that common for you to have some specific prompts like that to write a story off of?
It's not uncommon. I really believe in them, and I could probably, there's a story in The Color Master called The Fake Nazi, and I was reading at a reading, and someone asked me where the story came from, and I had to search back several memories to realize it came from an exercise I've sometimes given myself from based on fonts, where I'll be so bored and stuck, but I give myself a kind of set writing block amount of time, and I'll just feel like I have to sit there for a little longer. And So I'll just riff off fonts, like putting little paragraphs in different fonts, and whatever comes up in that one was based on the font Hoefler, Hoefler. And it became a guy, Hans Hoefler, who then became this whole story that he thought he was a Nazi, but he really had never been a Nazi. So that was a prompt that I gave myself, but it was like one of many, right? So it wasn't like all of those font stories worked. Most of them are terrible, but there was one that stood out that then one day I figured I'd work on a little bit more. So I could probably track a third of the stories in the book to something like that.
So how many font stories did you, like, could you quantify how many unrealized font stories you had?
40, maybe?
Oh, geez.
Yeah, I know. There's a magazine, Ziziba. It's a West Coast journal and based in San Francisco, and it published like 12 of them or something. And that was fun to try to put them in something that they're just paragraphs, so they're little, but just something that would be in some way readable because yeah, most of them are just like a little spew and then moving on to the next. But I really believe in the idea that you don't sit down with your material. You don't sit down knowing what you're going to write. You don't sit down with this idea, or if you do, that's usually the thing that's getting in your way. And that whatever you can do to jog yourself out of yourself into something new is a quicker route to better work.
I was going to ask you about that because, I mean, I saw that in addition to the fairy tale class, you teach a class on surreal writing, something along those lines.
I haven't in a while, but I used to a lot. And yeah.
Yeah, and so I was just wondering, as you say, when the process of writing these sort of surreal stories that you write seems much more amorphous and idiosyncratic than writing typical plotted kind of fiction. Is it hard to teach that, or is it hard to say what's working or what's not in a student story when it's in this realm of surrealism?
I don't think so. I mean, I do think it's, a teacher teaches what she knows. And so I definitely have that slant where I'm always trying to kind of loosen the students up and get them to follow a story's own movement, because I think there is a lot of impulse to plot something in advance or to kind of, at some point, frame it in a certain way. But then more often than not, it'll feel contrived. I think there are writers that can do that really well. But I would say most can't. And like Flannery O'Connor talks about it really well, where she talks about how a story can just kind of open itself up to you on the page if you let it. But with students, yeah, I think with a story that's sort of surreal or outside of realism in some way, I think maybe it's a more intuitive reading experience as opposed to thinking standard templates of plot and character. But even realism is like that too. Like going back to Raymond Carver, it's not like his stories followed any standard movement. I think all the classics have surprised me in that they're all kind of odd and are so rarely proportional in the way they set themselves out, or they're just like Moby Dick is just such a big, sprawling, obsessive thing, and it's an incredible book. And so how does a writer get to writing the thing that it just comes from a deeper place, whatever that is? And that can be, gritty, bare bone realism, or it can be as strange as a dream. But the idea is to just get to that place, to get to the deeper material, because otherwise, you can just sort of get garden variety magical stories, and you can get garden variety realistic stories, and you don't feel that the writer's presence is in that story.
But so you don't have a problem with students being defensive and saying, if you say, well, this this isn't working, they're like, well, it's supposed to be like that because it's weird, it's weird, it's supposed to be weird, things like that.
Well, no, I think that is a problem, because the idea is that the weirdness has to move beyond just weirdness. So it has to be a felt weirdness. It has to resonate in some way. And that's where workshop is a strange beast, because we're talking about resonance, and it's not like any checklist, So we're sitting around a table. The person has not completed this work. It's in progress. We're kind of getting in the muck with them, trying to talk about our experience. And I really encourage the class to speak about it ineffectually, like to really struggle with what you're trying to say and to try to articulate what you feel is coming at you from the story. And that's where, if something's weird and we're engaged with it, fabulous. But if something's weird and it feels kind of dumb, that comes across too all the time. Or if it just feels cute or clever or like it's avoiding something, that's loud and clear on the page. And so, yeah, then if a person says, well, I was just trying to be weird there, then it would go back to the same idea of, it's not showing up on the page. Whatever they're thinking is showing up on the page might not be.
Well, I mean, speaking of realism, I want to ask you about this quote, because this color master has a blurb from the Los Angeles Times where it starts out, at a time when realism reigned supreme over the literary landscape. I was just curious what you thought of it. Do you think that's an accurate statement about the current state of literature?
I mean, I love that quote, of course, because it's really nice. But yeah, I would say realism. I mean, it's probably still dominant, yeah, but I would say much less so than it was in the 80s and the 90s. So if I look now, I feel like there's a huge range of elements of strangeness, or thinking of Colson Whitehead and the Underground Railroad as like a real railroad. Like there he's dealing with realism, but he has this strangeness built in that's so much about his voice and his obsessions as a writer. So I feel like there's a lot of variety now. But if I were to say if we were to look at most books, I mean, think about memoir, like there's a huge surge in nonfiction right now. And I think it's amazing what people are doing, but that generally is grounded in reality for the most part.
Mm-hmm. Well, because I mean, when I read Willful Creatures back in 2007, I really liked it, and I went on Amazon.com, and it says, if you like this, you might like this as well. And I read a whole bunch of things I found through that, like Judy Budnitz and Julia Slavin.
Nice.
Oh, that's how I discovered Karen Russell and Stacey Richter. And then about a year later, around that time, I guess, you guys were all in the Tin House Fantastic Women special issue.
Yeah.
And it felt like there was a real moment going on. Did you feel like you were part of some movement or moment at that time?
I did. And it's great to hear. I mean, it's great to hear all the parts of that, finding the book, finding the other books, and all those writers who I love. And yeah, no, I did. I felt like there was kind of a wave that I got to ride on that's still happening. That is, and it's interesting. They're primarily women writers, but not all. And there is like a strong presence of the fairy tale behind them, or Kelly Link in there, Kevin Brockmeyer in there. Now Helen Oyeyemi, amazing. I'm reading a book right now, The Man Who Fell to Earth. Aimee is her last name. Anyway, it's a great collection that's coming out in summer. So it's just, I still see it happening, and I think it does supply a needed place for writers, because I think there was kind of an absence of it, and then whatever cracked open made space for us. It was nice.
Well,
Sarah Bynum, she's one too. Anyway, go ahead.
Oh yeah, well, you mentioned how many of these authors are women. I was just wondering if you have any thoughts about why that is.
I mean, I don't really know. I think I can make up reasons, which are just sort of fun to think of. But I guess the reason that I like is in the olden days when they would sit around and spin their wheels and tell the stories, those were mostly women, and they called them old wives' tales. And they had a kind of lineage of women sitting together. This goes to Amy Cutler, doing tasks, a kind of industry with their hands, and telling stories to each other and to children, and raising children, and the presence of these tales. So I guess I do see an echo from that.
I wonder if, I mean, to an extent that because writing had been dominated by men for so long, that a lot of this was unexplored territory, and so it feels very fresh and new in a way that, telling weird stories about magical stories about men's lives wouldn't feel that same freshness.
Yeah, I think that might be right. And it makes me think of how liberated I felt when I saw that Andrew Lang's Lilac Fairy book and Judith Grossman's List, and that was her, and she happened to love fairy tales, and she had this moment, and she was the female director, and she was flanked by wonderful writers, but who probably wouldn't have listed it, and that was her sort of idiosyncratic addition, and that spoke to me in some deep way about the validity of these fairy tales. And I think and I have heard, like, some of the nicest comments that I hear from readers is, oh, I didn't know this was allowed. So that there's something about permission that comes from, maybe that's the freshness that you're talking about. Or Linda Berry, a cartoonist and novelist I love, and she's a huge fan of the Grimm brothers tales, and you can feel it in her work. And there is this way that the storytelling seems to work with the fairy tales that does, it feels like there's some permission given in that. There's some validation.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned the idiosyncratic nature of this kind of writing, and I also wanted to ask you about this blurb from NPR. They call you one of the reigning masters of the eccentric short story. And I thought eccentric was kind of an interesting word choice there. Do you think of your writing as eccentric?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, what does it mean, right? What does eccentric really mean in terms of writing? I guess I just was so delighted by the blurb. It was so nice to be acknowledged.
It's just nice to be the reigning master of something. It doesn't matter so much what
exactly.
it is.
I'm happy to walk with a limp and have funny hair sticking up. Or if my stories look like that, I'm so thrilled. Yeah, I mean, I think that was Alan Chew's, and I think he was reading a lot of books, and so I think there is something for book critics. It's nice to hear if the majority of the stuff that's coming across their desk does seem to fall into the category of what we call realism, then yeah, I guess eccentric kind of works. I mean, what do you make of it as a word choice?
Well, I mean, because I come out of fantasy and science fiction, and so one thing that always strikes me is the lengths that people will go to avoid calling things fantasy or science fiction.
Yeah.
So I can't help but seeing it a little bit in that light. But
yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. And then Kelly Link feels like such a crucial champion, where she's really, I don't know, she's just kind of that world enough that I feel like there isn't a kind of shirking away from those terms. But you're right, fantasy and science fiction get an unfair rap.
I mean, I'm just curious, do you read authors from the fantasy and science fiction section of the store, or do you interact with them at all?
I don't interact with them that much, I'm thinking. But it's not out of it's just sort of like the circles of things that invite me. I think I just haven't had much contact really. But I'll read some, I think Jeff Vandermeer, who did an anthology of sort of fantastical fiction, and so he and I had a nice exchange about that. And I'm not averse to it. I mean, I think, interestingly, the place I see it most clearly sort of in my daily life is in teaching, where there are teachers who will tell their class, you can't write that. You can't write fantasy and science fiction, which I've always found really odd. Really, it's not addressing what makes a story work. It's not genre. Genre in my mind is not the deciding factor. So in some ways, I think I might see it more in student work than seeking it out on my own.
Yeah, well, I've met those teachers, so yeah, I can testify to that.
Yeah, so then you didn't write that way. You just felt like that was not available as an option. Is that how it worked?
Yeah, I mean, if the professor says, or the teacher says you have to write realism, then, you write realism. But
right. Yeah, I think it's the thing that bothers me about it is that goes back to the thing you were saying about the person who does weird for weird's sake. Yeah, it's a problem if you write a fantasy piece that just feels like rehash of some other fantasy piece. But that's true for realism too. In fact, it's more cynical when it's realism. I tend to feel like people who love fantasy and science fiction tend to be kind of earnest in their love, and people who if they're writing a literary, quote unquote, literary short story, but it feels still not quite of them, there's something bleaker to me about that than someone who's writing a fantasy story that's not of them. And both writers still need to kind of tap into what might be more alive and more their own, which I think it goes back to those barriers and using prompts and try to shake up the brain a little bit so that it doesn't go to its usual tracks.
Right. Well, I mean, because there was a weird whiplash experience for me growing up because I was always writing. And when I was a kid, people said you can't write fantasy and science fiction because that's too weird. And then, you get to sort of high school, college, and then they start saying you can't write fantasy and science fiction because that's too conventional. And it's kind of like,
Fascinating.
well, which is it? Make up your mind.
Yeah. And it does also, in my mind, it also makes it seem powerful. Like you start to feel like when anyone's putting the kibosh on something that you feel like there's no, like, why not? What's going to be so, like, yes, if you write something conventional, a teacher can really try to push you to maybe move away from the plot tropes that you might be employing or character movements or whatever, like how can you make the language more interesting? How can you make it more fresh? That's all totally worth going into, but that's just a totally different conversation than saying no fantasy or whatever. And I actually have several students right now who are writing pieces that are in some way skewed into fantasy or into science fiction or into tale telling. And there's some of the strongest writers in the class. I mean, it shows in the language. Like it would be such a problematic restriction, I think, for them.
Yeah. Well, it does seem to me there's a lot of crossover between fantasy and science fiction fans and the kind of writing you do. I mean, I first discovered you because Ben Rosenbaum interviewed you for Strange Horizons.
Oh, that's great. I love that. I love that interview. He's wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I read Girl in the Flammable Skirt, and that's kind of my introduction to your work. And I did notice looking, I mean, you've had one of your stories was reprinted in Lightspeed magazine, which is, we're sort of affiliated with them.
Yeah.
And you were nominated for a Tiptree Award and a Shirley Jackson Award. So there is kind of this sort of, common ground there.
Yeah. And actually, I was so thrilled about those nominations because of that. And in some ways, like marketing is interesting because I have this novel, The Particular Sadness of Lemon Cake, and it has kind of this light blue color, and it's gotten like a really good touring of book groups who tend to do more realism, and there's like a couple magical turns in the book, and one of them was a risk, and a lot of the people who are used to more traditional narratives won't go there. And I actually have longed for like the sci-fi readership to find the book, but I feel like if they looked at it, they would never think that book would be for them. And I've wondered, like, how do I tap into that? Because and more just for the feeling of like, I think they would get it. Like, I think it would be a leap that a lot of sci-fi readers would be willing to take that other readers won't go to. They'll just be like, well, I was with her for this part, but then I couldn't go there. And I feel like I believe in the turn in the story, but yeah, it alienated some readers. Some really go for it and some don't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's what I like about fantasy and science fiction readers. They tend to be very open-minded about content like that.
Yeah. There's some way that like the idea of talking about something in metaphor and not like a clear metaphor, but just something where the language is taking you somewhere and speaking of something where the meaning isn't immediately evident. Like that's my bread and butter. I just love that.
Yeah. I also really wanted to ask you about your story, Word Keepers. And you said that it's sort of inspired by this book called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. That's a great book just about how our reading attention is changing. And because we're always scanning and skimming, and it's harder to actually nestle down with a book and stay focused on it for a long time. And so he's just talking about it, and then he's talking about ways we can sort of combat it. It's just I thought it was a great read. And Word Keepers is about words and what words we use, and is it harder to find words now? And that I do see with my students and myself kind of hunting for words and forgetting what we're saying and sort of split attention. I see it all the time.
And I mean, have you been teaching long enough that you see the effect that the social media and all that kind of stuff has on student writing? Or
yeah I mean, I have at this point, I'm like 15 years teaching at college, and I was teaching before then as a grad student. And yeah, I mean, the student work, interestingly, I would say maybe it's more like what we were talking about earlier, like there's more space for outside of realism. There's more kind of a natural movement towards that. There are more stories I can bring them that I can dip into Poe and Kafka, but I also can be bringing in Karen Russell and be bringing in Kelly Link and all that. And they're usually so into it. But what I do see is a little different attention span, or like they'll complain a little more if stories are slow, if like the published stories that I give them are a little slow. They'll complain sort of wryly, like, we know that we're supposed to be reading this, but it actually was a little hard. So that's interesting. That feels new.
I mean, is there anything to be done? I mean, do you think people should give up their iPhones and Facebooks, or like what is the?
I mean, they won't give them up. But I do think, my guess, and I've heard this talked about, and I think he talks about this a little bit in The Shallows, of just like hotels where you have to check in your phone, that I think culturally, like we've just been given this giant toy box and it's endless. But then I think through the decades, we'll learn ways to put limits on it personally, like that all these apps that can shut off things, I think are helpful for writers, that you can shut off the internet, you could, the Freedom app and all that. But I think there are going to be more and more things like that. Like, what's the way that you can actually take a break from social media? I mean, I just feel like people will need that. Or there's these camps. Have you heard of these camps where you go for a weekend and you have to give up your phone, and then
no.
you make up a new name or something? But you're just at camp all weekend without your phone. It's like corporations or something. I don't know. But it looked really fun. It seemed like a rare liberation.
I mean, because there's sort of this perennial hope, it seems, on the part of people who really admire short stories, that shorter attention spans are going to lead to this surge of popularity of short fiction, but it never seems to quite happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think in the same way, though, that I don't believe that short stories will die, I also don't believe they're going to, suddenly become the new wave of fashion. But I guess in France, they're giving them out in vending machines or something. But like, where do I know that piece of information? From social media. So I'm full of little tidbits, as we all are. And I do feel in myself how you have to clear a space to be able to focus on something and concentrate. You really have to actively make a wall from some of that stuff. It's a powerful pull. Yeah.
Well, sort of my take on it is that the part of reading a story that requires the most effort, but is also the most rewarding, is reconfiguring your brain to understand who these characters are and what the world is and what the rules are and things like that. And reading short stories requires you to do that every 15 minutes or something. Whereas if you read some long series, you just have to do that basically pretty much once at the beginning, and then you can just kind of coast from there on out.
So that the pleasure with short stories is from that reconfiguring constantly. Like, that's part of the pleasure of it.
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I can speak for myself, but I think that's true for me. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's really interesting. But I think you also then lay out an interesting challenge to novelists to say, like, is there a way to continually reconfigure? I don't know. Like, that's sort of like Cloud Atlas is like that, where you have different chapters and each chapter is exactly what you're saying, but they all build on a common theme.
Yeah. No, but I mean, I think for me, but reading a novel like Cloud Atlas or reading a short story collection, it's kind of like one of those fraternity initiation things where they put you a bag over your head and drive you out into the middle of nowhere and you, like, take it off and you're like, where am I? How do I survive? What's going on?
Exactly. That's exactly right. Like, what are these words? Where am I? Yeah. Yeah. Then you feel kind of proud when you're fully hazed and then you made it through.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so we have just a couple minutes left. I really want to ask you about your story, End of the Line, is the story that's just always really stuck in my mind so much. Could you just say kind of where that story came from?
Oh, thanks. I'm glad. And it's, I don't have a kernel directly, but I think if we go like back to the reading as a kid, and there were like, because there's a big man and a little man, and there were all those stories about little people. There were the borrowers, there was Gulliver's Travels, there was Stuart Little, all the little like matchbox things. Like, there was something so fun about that little world, and I'm the youngest of three, and so I didn't have a little sibling to persecute and adore in that way that older siblings, I think, can do. And so I think I was always obsessed because of that with the little people idea. Like, what would that happen? And then into adulthood, thinking of that idea of like, what would really happen if you could actually have a little person, if you could go buy a little person and then playing it out in terms of power dynamics. So I think it came from a sort of joyful, whimsical place, but then I wrote it in little bits because it was freaking me out. So I would write it and then I'd work on something else and then I'd write it. And then finally, like a couple years later, the little bits coalesced into a story and I felt like I could show it to someone. But it made me uncomfortable. So I would just work on it for short periods at a time.
Right, because it's a decidedly R-rated kind of Stuart Little story.
Yeah, and it's pretty harsh. I mean, it's about torture, really, and power, and people in a very satisfying way have read all kinds of meaning into it. So, and I really like hearing that. So, but I think it was interesting to me that I would dip in it and then dip out. And then when it ended up being a whole story that I could show to someone, it was about more complexity than I realized. So it's another way of just like, it's meaningful for me that if there's any material that's beckoning, even if it feels repellent, to really try to go there because you don't know what's on the other side of it.
So do any of those reactions that you've gotten from people stick out in your mind?
Someone thought about it in terms of slavery. Someone thought about it in terms of abusive relationships. Someone thought about it in terms of, just the confusion of whether or not, or just feeling compassion for the big man at the end and feeling so unsettled by that. I can feel it when I read that story aloud. It's really fun to read aloud, but I can feel the moment where the audience feels uncomfortable. And it's really interesting for me to just be able to track that so closely. That it's funny up to a certain point, and then they're like, "Oh, this isn't funny," and so I feel like I'm persecuting the audience a little bit, which is just really interesting from my perspective. That I'm trying to go somewhere with them and to take them with me, and then, but again, like none of that was in my mind consciously when writing it. I'll have this kind of set block of time and I would just open up the file and then literally work on it for like 3 minutes and then be like, okay, no, something else. Because it felt a little like a hot potato, I guess.
Yeah, no, and I would really, really encourage people to go check out that story because as you say, it has an incredible amount of impact in just 10 pages or something. It's a really concentrated dose of impact.
Thank you.
All right, cool. And so we're all out of time now. So, Aimee, do you want to just tell us what you're working on now, or anything else you want people to go check out?
I'm working on a novel, so I'm just kind of exploring it. So I have nothing I can tell concretely about that. But there was this 7x7 thing. That's a cool site to look at. It's 7x7, and that's a new piece that's findable online.
So they would just search for 7x7 Aimee Bender or something and it would come up?
Yeah, I think that would work.
All right, great. So everyone go check that out. And I think we're going to have to wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Aimee Bender, and her book again is called To the Color Master. And so, Aimee, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Aimee Bender for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's given us 5 stars on iTunes, including Garfage in the UK, who writes, "Great, high-quality podcast. This is a really well-made podcast that is always a credit to the host, who always researches and prepares with an incredible level of professionalism. I now look forward to the episodes. Keep up the good work." So big thanks again to Garfage for that great review. Special thanks as well to Matt Hopper and Ollie Zem, who both just signed up this week to support us on Patreon. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is made possible thanks to support from listeners like you. So if you enjoy the show and want it to continue, please sign up to give us $1 or $2 per episode over at patreon.com/geeks. And if you'd rather make a one-time or fixed monthly contribution, you can do that via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. So big thanks again to everyone who's contributed. We really appreciate it. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.